Good evening. So I knocked my stuff off. Well, good evening. It's good to see you tonight. Welcome to our midweek Bible study. We're glad you're here tonight, and we're grateful. I'll borrow this from you. I lost mine. I'm gonna borrow one. Something happened to my list tonight, so I'll give it right back to you. Let me just welcome you if you're watching online tonight. We're glad to have you with us as always. Let me ask you to take your list that you got when you came in tonight and look on the bottom of it. We've got a lot of stuff going on, and I want to just call your attention to a few things here. We have two ministries, as we have been announcing, that are starting tomorrow night. One of them is Grief Share, and the other one is Embrace Grace, and both of those will be beginning tomorrow night. So specifically, I want you to pray for those two ministries, for the people that are participating in them. Regarding the Embrace Grace ministry, please pray that the Lord will bring us some young ladies that we can minister to. That's part of it, and this is one of those deals where there is a website, and we may have somebody show up tomorrow night that we're not expecting to come, which is fine. But just pray that God will open up the door and bring us some young ladies to minister to. It's a very, very important, vital ministry. Bottles and Blessings continues this month. Bottles with a collection, with the love offering for the Help Pregnancy Center, and then the blessing, a gift of some kind, and all that information is back there on the table. There will be a week from tonight, which will be the 12th, February the 12th at 6:15 in the choir room, a very, very important Sunday school teachers meeting. So if you are a teacher, if your teacher's not here, please pass along that information. Or even if you're a substitute teacher, next Wednesday night at 6:15 in a choir room, we have some information to share with you about an emphasis in Sunday school that we have coming up. So please put that on your calendar, and we hope that you'll be here next Wednesday night. The Ground 40 meal is the 14th of February, which is a week from Friday. I believe the sheets are out there on the table. The Women's Book Club will meet on the 17th at 6 o'clock at the Derby. The Men's Ministry Dinner is Thursday, February the 27th. Brother Tommy, is there a sign-up sheet for the men out here? Is that out there? Okay, so guys, there's a sign-up sheet out there if you want the men's dinner on the 27th, and that will be at 6:30, and got a special guest speaker that night, so I hope, guys, that you'll sign up and come and join us. And then I wanted to mention, I also wanted to mention, I forgot to put this on the list for tonight, but don't forget the Discovery class is March the 2nd. So that'll begin March the 2nd, 4 Sundays during the Sunday school hour. And we hope that you'll participate, or if you know someone that would like to, just please contact Pastor Gary. But I think we've already got 6 or 7 already signed up. And so if you want to participate in that, please help us get the word out. And that description is in your bulletin about that class. I wanted to say just a word about Upward Soccer. Upward Soccer will be, typically we've been having tryouts at the end of February, and then the season starts about the middle of March. This year, as you know, this season is going to be trying because of Miss Angie's situation. So there are some extra needs due to that, and that they are needing some help with. So there was some information in your bulletin on Sunday, but I want you to, if you're interested in helping in any way, they need some help, not just with coaches, but with some administrative things, organizational type things. So this Sunday morning after the service, right down front here, Brother Scott's going to meet and just answer any questions that you may have. Now, this is for teenagers can help. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how old you are. Doesn't matter what your background is. But if you're interested, please plan to stay just a few minutes after the service on Sunday morning, and they can give you some information, a little more details about what's needed. But they're going to need some help for this season. So please keep that in mind and put that on there. Put that on your list as well. Thank you, sir. All right. So please remember those items as we go throughout this week. Well, let's take our Bibles tonight. If you would find the book of 1 Thessalonians one more time, as we are looking at the theme "Living in the Light of Eternity." And tonight, guess what? I found my sheet right under my thing. That's pretty bad when you put it right on your podium and can't find it, isn't it? 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. We began chapter 2 last Wednesday night. And the theme, of course, the general theme is around the return of Christ, the beginning of eternity. And we've, in chapter 2 of 1 Thessalonians, we've been talking about the fact that the second coming, the return of Christ, is a stimulating truth. It is something that ought to stimulate us, that ought to motivate us to ministry and to serving others. And so in chapter 2, the Apostle Paul is reminding the Thessalonians about his ministry among them, how he has served them. And the way he ministered to them is the way you and I should be ministering and serving, both inside and outside the church. So in chapter 2, Paul is talking about some important ingredients for effective ministry. He says, number one, we need to pay attention to the message that we proclaim. In the first 2 verses of 1 Thessalonians 2, he's focusing on the message of the gospel and how we need to proclaim it in the best way possible. We need to proclaim it with steadfastness and also understanding that there will be suffering attached to it. The second thing we need to be concerned about are the motives that we possess. So starting in verse 3, Paul talks about the motives for ministry. Motives do matter. So we're going to pick up tonight in verse 4 of chapter 2. And we said that Paul's motives in his ministry were pure. In other words, he was right up front. And number 2, his motives were pleasing. Paul's motives in his ministry were pleasing. But it's important that our motives please the right people. So look in verse 4 of 1 Thessalonians 2 at what Paul says. As he continues to write to them, he says in verse 4, "But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak." Paul's ministry was not made up and it was not man-made. Paul wants the people to understand, this was not my idea. I didn't come up with this ministry. I didn't make it up. It wasn't something I developed. Where did Paul get his ministry from? God gave it to him. God gave him his ministry. It wasn't man-made or made up. And as a matter of fact, you'll notice he says in verse 4, we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. The word approved there means tested. Paul says God has tested us, and after God tested us, he considered him a suitable vessel. So Paul looked at his ministry as not just something to do, but as a sacred trust that God had given to him. No matter what your ministry is, whether it's a teacher or whatever else you do, however you minister, you ought to consider it a sacred trust from God, not something that's just man-made. When you hear the word stewardship, when we hear the word stewardship, what do we normally think of first thing? Money. Primarily, when you hear the word stewardship, we think of finances, we think of money. And certainly that's a part of stewardship. Being a steward, remember, just means that we're a manager or an owner of what doesn't belong to us. But stewardship applies not only to material things and not only to physical things, but stewardship applies to spiritual things. So Christians, the spiritual things that God has entrusted to us, we are accountable for. And we are to be good stewards of. We have been entrusted with the gospel. Every one of us have been entrusted with the gospel. Whether you're an ordained minister or not, it's not the point. Every one of us have been entrusted with the gospel. And we are to manage that. We are to consider that a sacred trust and be good stewards of the gospel. Now, we know that if I know I'm to be a good steward of my money and I never give it, am I really a good steward financially? If I never give, am I a good steward financially? No. What if I never share my faith? Am I a good steward of the gospel that's been entrusted to me? No. Paul said, my ministry is a stewardship from God. And then look at the end of verse 4. Look at the second part of verse 4. He goes on to say this. We've been entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak. And then he says this, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts. Paul said if you're going to have an effective ministry, you can't be concerned about pleasing people, about pleasing men. Paul's ministry was not built around pacifying men. His ministry was built upon pleasing God. Those are really our only two choices. We've got to ask ourselves the question, everything that we do as followers of Christ, am I doing this to please people or am I doing this to please God? What is my number one motivation above all? Paul wasn't concerned with pleasing men. He was concerned most of all with pleasing God. Someone said it this way, it doesn't matter who you please if you displease God, and it doesn't matter who you displease if you please God. So in other words, sometimes in order to please God, we're going to have to displease people. Isn't that right? Isn't that right? Paul found that out. Did Paul please everybody? Were people always happy with Paul? Are you kidding me? Sometimes, no, we don't intentionally want to go out and irritate people and displease people. But sometimes we have a choice between pleasing God and pleasing people, and we better make sure we know what we're going to choose to do. And if it comes down to a matter, Paul said, if it comes down to a matter of choosing, I'm going to choose to please God Paul could have saved himself a lot of pain and a lot of trouble and a lot of heartache if he'd just given in every now and then, just compromised just a little bit and tried to pacify a few people. He could have probably made his life a lot easier, but the problem with that is he would have displeased the one who called him into ministry. And Paul said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to please the Lord first and foremost. So Paul had motives that were pure and motives that were pleasing. Now, let's go to verse 5. As we begin this next section, we've seen that Paul's motives were pure and his motives were pleasing. So then as we get into verse 5, we're going to talk about his methodology. And we find out that his methodology was productive. In other words, because Paul had a powerful message, the gospel, and pure, pleasing motives, he had a productive ministry. So Paul talks about the nuts and bolts of how he did his work, the nuts and bolts of how he served. So he says there are several elements to this that made his ministry productive. Number one, he talks about his conduct. His conduct. So look at verse number 5. And starting in verse 5, he tells us about his conduct. In other words, the way he lived, the way he behaved. And he talks about, he says, first of all, there were some things that I rejected, that I didn't want, that I shunned, I put away. And the first thing he put away is given to us in verse 5. Look at it. He says in verse 5, for neither at any time did we use flattering words, as you know. Neither at any time did we use flattering words. Paul said the first thing I shunned was guile. Anybody know what guile is? Anybody know what guile is? G-U-I-L-E? Guile is insincerity, to be insincere, to be a phony, to be insincere in how you conduct yourself. And he uses the phrase flattering words. Paul said, when we were among you, I did not use flattering words. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Be honest. God will kill you for lying. How many of you like to be flattered? Really? Can we just be dead honest tonight and say sometimes it's sort of good to be flattered? Let me ask you another question. How can you tell the difference between flattery and just a good solid compliment? How do you differentiate between flattery and a real heartfelt compliment? How do you tell the difference, guys? Can you tell when somebody's just flattering or trying to flatter you and where they're being sincere? How do you tell the difference? Huh? Well, but you don't know their motive. You may not know their motive. You just feel like they're just trying to flatter. You think it's just a feeling. I think you got to look and ask yourself the question. You got to ask, what is the result of this? A sincere compliment is meant to build someone up, comes from the heart, and it's intended to encourage. Somebody's a flatterer, and by the way, if they'll flatter you to your face, they will gossip about you behind your back. Make no mistake about it. If they're insincere in what they say to you good, you better believe they'll cut you in ribbons behind your back. Just take that to the bank. Flattery is something that is said to manipulate you, to get you to do a certain thing, okay? It is not meant to build you up and to encourage. It is meant to manipulate you. The word there, that phrase literally comes from a word that refers to setting a hook or putting bait on a hook. Why do fishermen put bait on a hook? To lure, what was that? Catch bigger fish. Yeah, but we don't. Unless you're like me, you don't fish with just a hook. Okay, you put bait on there because the idea is a little bit of deception, right? You're trying to lure the fish into that trap. So flattery is like putting bait on a hook. And there were people in Paul's day. By the way, there still are, whose method is to lure people with their flattering words for the purpose of manipulating and deceiving and getting people to do what they want them to do. Paul says to these Thessalonians, when we were among you, and you know this, he says, we did not use flattering words. We never said anything to you with the intention of just deceiving you. Everything we said to you was sincere. And ladies and gentlemen, as followers of Christ, we need to be sincere with each other. False flattery gets nowhere. I jotted this down the other day. Someone was talking about the difference. Flattery is from the teeth out, but sincere appreciation is from the heart out. Okay? You see the difference? Flattery is from the teeth out. In other words, it's shallow. It doesn't mean anything. Sincere appreciation is from the heart out. Now, we can enjoy flattery, but I love this quote. Flattery is like chewing gum. Enjoy it, but don't swallow it. Okay? I thought that was good. All right, so Paul says, number one, my conduct, I shunned. I got rid of flattery, of guile. All right? Paul wasn't some clever salesman trying to trick them into doing something. He said, I'm not going to work that way. Number two, he said, I'm going to shun the idea of gain. Gain. Look at what he says next in verse number 5. He says, we did not use flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak for covetousness. A cloak for covetousness. What does it mean to covet? To be greedy, to desire, to gain for oneself. Paul said, not only did I get rid of guile, I got rid of gain, the idea of gain. What it's talking about is this. He had no ulterior motive of getting things for himself. Paul could have demanded certain things from these people as the apostle. He could have demanded more financial support. He could have demanded this, demanded that. He could have gained all kinds of things for himself. Paul says that was not part of my conduct either. I had no guile. And I had no sense of gain or covetousness. In other words, we better be careful about doing anything for the Lord with the main motivation of what we can get out of it. If our motive for serving the Lord, if that's our number one goal of serving, is for what we can gain out of it, we're spinning our wheels. If we're trying to gain something. Now, when we serve the right way, we will gain. I believe that. God will bless us. But if gaining something is our goal before we ever do it, we're going to be spinning our wheels. So Paul said, I got rid of my guile. I got rid of my sense of gain. And then number three, and this is big. He says, I also got rid of my glory. My glory. Look at verse 6. In verse 6 he says, nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, when we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. There was, in New Testament times, there was no greater office than the office of an apostle. Christians respected the apostles tremendously. And because of that, those Christians, those followers could have been manipulated, and Paul and these guys could have used this for an occasion to bring glory to themselves. They could have shined a spotlight. Here we are. Here's what we're doing. Look at us. Paul says we did not do that for the glory of men. We got rid of our sense of gain, and we got rid of our sense of glory. We didn't want glory for ourselves. There again, there were a lot of teachers in that day. There are a lot of teachers now that do. But Paul says, I got rid of the glory. So Paul says, as far as my conduct goes, there was no guile, there was no gain, and there was no glory. Now he turns it around to a positive way. Look at what he says next about his conduct. Here's the positive aspect of this. He says, I've showed you what I shunned. Now let me show you what I showed. Look at verse 7. The first thing Paul says to these people is, you know that I showed you love. He showed them love. Look at verse 7. He says to them, but we were gentle among you. Now, when you think of the Apostle Paul, how many of you would say the first thing that I think of when I think of Paul is gentle? That's not the first word that comes to my mind. A lot of other words, but not gentle. So that's a little bit interesting, isn't it? Paul says, when we came to you, we were gentle. We were loving. We showed love to you, genuine love to you. By the way, Paul loved both the lost and the saved. We know he loved the saved, the followers of Christ, the churches, but he also loved the lost. That's what made him both a great missionary and a great pastor. He was a missionary, but he was a missionary with a pastor's heart. That's what he was. And the only way he could be that was to have genuine love for the people that he ministered to. He says, I showed you love. And far from exploiting these people, he cared for these people. Now, look at that phrase there in verse number 7. We were gentle among you just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. The word nourishes there, or cherishes there, is a word that means to warm. To warm. It is literally a picture of a mother bird nursing and warming her babies. Okay? That gentle nursing action of a mother bird for her children. If you think about it this way, he's saying, I cherish you the way a mother cherishes her own children. Now, think about a mother nursing a baby. What's literally happening there? That mother is literally giving out of her own body to provide nourishment for that child. Isn't that right? The mother is giving of herself so that nourishment might flow into those children. So what does that tell you about what Paul was doing with these Christians? He was giving of himself for what purpose? For what purpose? Why does that mother nurse that baby? Obviously, obviously there's an intimacy, but what's the basic reason she nurses that baby? To nourish that child, to provide nourishment that child might grow and develop. Paul said, I loved you like a mother loves her children, and my goal was that you might grow stronger in your Christian walk because of my ministry among you. Love, the love of a mom. Paul said, that's what I gave you. And as I mentioned to you last week, what I love about this is everything Paul was saying, they knew, they'd seen it, they'd witnessed it. He wasn't trying to argue. He was just simply stating fact. This is who I was. I showed you love. Number 8, look at verse 8. He also gave them life. Not only love, but life. And this is what he says in verse 8. He says, so affectionately longing for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. Can you see the words of affection there? The words of affection, the words of fellowship there. Paul did not just give them love, he gave them life. I don't mean he gave them, he gave them his life. Here's what he says again. Look at it again. We didn't just give you the gospel of God, but we gave you our own lives. We gave you our own lives. He did not just preach the gospel to them. That was true. He certainly preached the gospel to them, but that's not all him and Silas and Timothy did. They literally gave their lives. They poured their life into those people, okay? Poured life into their people. It is impossible to minister without giving yourself and part of yourself. By very definition, ministry, in whatever form it takes, involves giving up part of your life and giving some things without expecting a thing back in return. It just is. There is no way to minister without investing part of our life in that ministry. And it doesn't matter what your particular ministry is. If all you're doing is a job, if that's all you're doing is a job and performing a list of duties, you're missing it. It's about investing your life and pouring your life into somebody else. Whatever that looks like, whatever that means. And Paul was able to say, I gave you my life. I think Brother Paul here would say, and Pastor Gary would say, Brother Ted too, everywhere we've been over the course of our ministry, when you go from one place to another, you leave a part of your heart and a part of your life in a former place. You just do. And if you don't, then you really haven't done much, okay? So Paul says, I gave them love. I gave you guys life. I poured my life into you. Real ministry is costly. To really minister costs something. There's no easy way. And number three, the last thing is, he talks about what he shared. We've talked about what he shunned, what he showed them. Now look at what he shared. Look at verse 9. In verse 9 he says, for you remember, brethren, our labor and toil, for laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. We preach to you the gospel of God. What did Paul share with these people? Shared the gospel, but what else did he share? He shared labor. What does it mean right there when he says to them, laboring night and day? Laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. Now, what does that mean?
They tried to provide for their own means by working as well as ministry. But I think also the point of sharing our lives, your ministry is only as effective as your witness of what your life is Christ is.
Yep.
I'm sure what they were doing was showing how Christ had changed them, how Christ had made them who they were now, and this was why they were doing it.
That's right, too. They were sharing their very life, their very fact that they were there ministering to them was designed to be a teaching tool for them. They shared their testimony as well, laboring night and day, not to be a burden. And the first thing that he said, they did not. They took care of their own needs. Didn't Paul have another job? Okay. Why'd they do that? He could have demanded financial reimbursement. He could have done that. But Paul said, we did not do that. We shared in your labor so that we might not be a burden to you. And that, of course, had an impact on those people that they were ministering to. So Paul says in terms of my conduct. One of the reasons that his ministry was productive was because of his conduct, the way that they behaved, the way they conducted themselves. Look at verse 10. Here's another reason that their method was productive, and that is his conscience. His conscience. Look at verse number 10. He says, you are witnesses, and God also. Stop right there. I hear people say in a very light, like a very flippant tone, God is my witness. You better be careful saying that. Be careful using that phrase. Paul was so certain of what he was about to say that he said, not only do you know what I'm about to say, but God is also my witness. You are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believe. Paul's behavior was clean and clear, not only in the eyes of man, but in the eyes of God. So Paul uses 3 words to describe his behavior. He says, my conscience is clear because I know that I did things the right way. Number 1, he says, I was among you devoutly. Devoutly. What does it mean to be devout? Excuse me? Devoted to who? All right, strongly devoted to God. He says, I was among you devoutly. That means he was faithful in his duties toward God. In the scriptures, when it talks about somebody being devout, it means that it talks about their devotion to the Lord. So Paul says, my conscience is clear because I know that what I did in terms of being faithful to God. I did in a devoted manner, a devoted manner, devoutly. What does it mean to do justly? He says, I was also among you justly. What does that mean? Paul says, I did it devoutly, faithful to God. I did it justly, faithful to people, faithful to you. Okay, no favoritism. He said, I treated you justly. I treated you the right way. He's talking to these Christians. He says, I ministered devoutly, faithful to God. I ministered justly, doing the right thing, being faithful toward people. And then he says, I also did it blamelessly. What does that mean? We behave devoutly, justly, and blamelessly. What does that mean? That no one could find fault. Does the word blameless mean perfect? By the way, you know we're called to be blameless. We of us in this building tonight are called to be blameless. Does that mean perfect? Is it the same thing? Okay, blameless. How many perfect people have ever lived? So that answers the question about whether blameless means perfect. The same as perfect, doesn't it? Blameless does not mean absolute perfection, but it does still mean to live in such a way that people cannot honestly have a charge against you. Now, you and I both know people are going to charge us, and they're going to find fault with us. I don't care, people are going to find fault, but what he means is this. We lived in such a way that nobody could find fault with us without having to make it up, without having to lie about it, okay? That won't stop people from making false accusations. And Paul had plenty of them. There were people running all over the ancient world accusing Paul of this and that and the other. They were slandering him in Thessalonica, trying to charge him with being nothing but a money grubber, and he didn't care about him and all this kind of stuff. And ladies and gentlemen, people are going to do the same thing with us. That's not what blame, but they're going to do that. But we are, I guess what I'm trying to say is Paul said to be blameless means You're not going to stop people from trying to blame you, but don't give them ammunition. Don't provide them the ammunition to do it with. Okay? Yep. No one could legitimately bring charges against him. Legitimately. So we know this. Your life and mine will either back up our testimony or it will destroy it. That's what it boils down to. Our life will either back up our testimony or it will destroy our testimony. And Paul was able to say, not only in the sight of others, but in the sight of God himself, my life backed up my testimony. To be blameless means to live in such a way that anyone who finds fault with you will have to tell a lie to do it. I love this. I love this quote. Someone defined being blameless this way: to have the confidence that you would not be afraid to sell your talking parrot to the town gossip. Isn't that good? You wouldn't be afraid to sell your talking parrot to the town gossip. You think about that for a minute. That's a pretty high bar. That's a pretty high bar. So Paul says, my conscience is clear. I've served among you devoutly and justly and blamelessly. And then a third reason that his ministry was productive is because of his concern. His conduct, his conscience, and his concern. Look at verse 11 and 12. Paul was really concerned about these people. And we ought to be genuinely concerned about those that we are ministering to. Look at verse number 11. First of all, he had a fatherly concern. Look at verse 11. As you know, there's that phrase again, you know this, how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father does his own children. He had a fatherly concern. Paul considered himself, and I think rightly so, the spiritual father of all of those who were saved under his ministry. He called Timothy his son in the faith. He considered himself a father. He had a fatherly concern, not just for Timothy, but for all those that came to faith under his ministry and those that he came across. He had a genuine fatherly concern for these people. That means he was not content to simply win people to Jesus. He was content, once they have come to Christ, to watch them grow and mature in their faith. It's one of the reasons that after he went on that first missionary journey and those churches were established, he went back again. And in some cases, he went back a third time. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to make sure that these people weren't just saved, that they were growing, they were maturing, they were developing in their faith. That's what a father wants for their child, right? Isn't the father's concern for that child to grow up, to mature, to be strong? He had a fatherly concern for these people. And notice, and so because he had a fatherly concern, look at what he says he did for them. So let's define these words here. He says, first of all, we exhorted you. What does it mean to exhort somebody? Huh? Or encourage. Yeah, encourage. Did you know, according to Hebrews 10:25, that we are to be exhorting each other? This, we talk about the first part of that verse. Do not forsake the assemblings of yourselves together, okay? But rather be exhorting one another, and even more so as we see the day approaching. One of the reasons that it's important for us to be here together on a regular basis is that we might exhort one another, encourage one another, cheer one another on. So there were times where Paul would simply exhort these people. He'd, give them a personal pet rally. He would exhort them and cheer them up. That's one way that he showed his concern. Comforted. But we know what that means. There were times he exhorted them, and there are other times he came along, put his arm around them, and comforted them. Whatever it was, to seek to bring comfort in their time of pain or their time of pressure. And then, what about the word charged? That word charged is a word that means challenge or implore. Now, what's the difference between exhorting and charging? Exhorting means to encourage and say, come on now. You know what charge means? Get in their face, eyeball to eyeball, and say, now look here. Okay? There were times he just got in their face and said, look. And folks, every one of us in this room need those three things in our life. We need the ability to have people do that for us, and we need somebody that we can do that too. All right? There are times we need people to come alongside and exhort us. There are other times we need people to come along and comfort us. Now, you can sit here and be Mr. and Miss Spiritual and pretend you don't need that, but I'm going to tell you, I need a kick in the pants every now and then. Now, you can deny that and walk out of here and go to bed and sleep well. Good for you. But I think every one of us, if we're gut level honest, needed time for somebody to grab us by the collar in a loving way. No, but I'm saying, look, come on now. Come on. This is wrong. You're not getting it done. Get with the program. We need that to happen. Now, do we do that because we're trying to hurt each other? No. Paul said, I did this because I loved you as a father. And that's the way I show concern for you. And if we've got our brothers and sisters in Christ and we see something going on in their life, and we say, well, I'm just going to leave them alone, that's their business, we're not doing our job. We're not doing our job. We need people like that. We need people like that in our life. I've been a part of a pastor's group for the last 17, 18 years. Why'd I hang out with these guys? Number one, because I'm nuts. I'm crazy. Because they're a bunch of fruitcakes. But on a deeper level, the reason I hang out with those guys is because there are times when we look at each other and say, brother, come on now, really? There are other times we cry together, and then there's some times where we just have to say, come on, it's going to be okay, all right? I hope you have somebody in your life that can do that for you. I hope you do. Because if you don't, it's awfully hard to grow and mature and make progress without having somebody like that in your life. That's why church matters. That's why Sunday school matters. That's why the fellowship of the saints matters. That's why people say they do not need church, they do not need any of that. That's why, spiritually speaking, they're dying on the vine. Because they don't have, they're throwing away all the opportunities to do that. We need people like that in our life. So I hope that, number one, you've got somebody like that in your life, and number two, that you can be like that for somebody else. I hope there's somebody in your life that you can go to and do one of those three ministries when it is necessary. And all three are. I'm like you. I'd much rather be exhorted and comforted than I had be charged. But there are times all three are necessary. So he had a fatherly concern for them. But look at verse 12. He also had a fundamental concern for them. Look at verse number 12. He says to them, I have this fatherly concern for you, that you would walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Paul's concern in exhorting and comforting and charging these people was not just to make a point. What was his ultimate fundamental goal for these Thessalonian Christians? That they might do what? Walk worthy of God. That they might walk worthy of God. He wanted these people to walk worthy of God. Now, that throws us a little bit for a loop, because when we hear the word worthy, the first thing that crosses our mind is, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy. He's not talking about being worthy. None of us are worthy on our own of what God has done for us. Y'all know that, right?
Sounds to me pretty much what Paul's saying is that process of sanctification. Like, you know you're going to be sanctified. You know it's an inside cleansing every day. And I think that's what you want these people saying every day. You're just preparing yourself.
Every single day making progress. We are not worthy of what has been done for us, not a one of us, and never will be. But we have been called, and Paul says it in other places in his epistles, we are called to live worthy. He says it in Philippians. He says it in 2 Thessalonians, that we are to live worthy. We are to walk worthy. He's not talking about being worthy. To walk worthy simply means, and boy, this is a big one now. Here's the question I've got to ask myself, and you've got to ask yourself. Is the life I'm living right now as a Christian, is it worth the blood that was shed on the cross to purchase me? Is it worth the cost? Is it worth the price? Now, we don't have to pay for our salvation. That's not what I'm saying. Salvation's free. But our response to that ought to be to live in a way that says, I want to be worthy of what Jesus has done for me. Did you ever see the movie Saving Private Ryan? Anybody ever see that movie? Except for the first 10, 15 minutes, it was a good movie. I couldn't watch the first 10 or 15 minutes of it. But you remember that story, right? You remember how that little gang of soldiers went back to get this boy, Private Ryan, right? And get him back to his mother, because the mother had already lost 2 sons in the war and all that kind of stuff. So they go through all the battles to get the boy home. And finally, every member of that team is killed, including Tom Hanks. Okay? Gives his life up. In the very last scene, Tom Hanks has been shot. He's about to breathe his last breath, and he looks at Sergeant Ryan, and he says, be worthy of this. Be worthy of this. What was he telling him? You've got a life, you got a chance at life. Now go out and live worthy of the blood that's been shed on this battlefield for you. And in the very closing scene, he stands in front of the cross of those soldiers. And he looks at his wife, Sergeant Ryan does, and says, tell me I'm a good man. Please tell me I'm a good man, and tell me that I'm worthy of what they did. That's the image right there, guys. To live worthy. The life that we're living, to be worthy of the price that he's paid for us. And that's what Paul is saying his goal was for these Thessalonians. As a father wants to be proud of his children, the Lord wants to get glory through the lives of his children. The Lord does want to be proud of us, but his ultimate goal is that he might receive glory from our life. That's why Paul closes by saying, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. It's all about the glory of God. We sung a few minutes ago, glorify your name. Glorify thy name in all the earth. That's what this is all about, the glory of God. The glory of God. That's why we were created. That's why we were redeemed. That's what it's all about. It's his glory. To thine be the glory forever and ever. And it's about God's glory. So he wants us to live worthy of our dignity now. In other words, he wants us to live in a way that will let the world see Christ in us now, but also to live worthy of the destiny that we have yet to come. To live worthy of that place that we call heaven, the place that is our real home. And that was Paul's goal for these people, and that is God's goal for us. So if we're going to minister effectively, we have to have the message, to proclaim the right message. We have to have the right motives. And if we do that, then our ministry will be productive, whatever that may be. And I want to remind you, when I say ministry, I'm not talking about necessarily a job in the church. I'm talking about something that God's called you to do. something that He's gifted you to do. And that has to be our game plan all the way through. All right? All right, let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for this time together tonight. We are so grateful for the words of Paul, because we know that they were given not only to these Thessalonian Christians, but also for those of us here tonight, every one of us. Lord, may we let this sink into our hearts tonight and search and see if we're really serving you, if we're proclaiming the right message, if we have the right motives. Father, please. And then if we're acting in the right ways, Father, may our conduct and our conscience and our concern, may people know about us that those three things are real. Lord, I thank you for my brothers and sisters tonight. We pray as we continue to talk about living in the light of eternity that we will be stimulated to do all of this because of the fact that we don't have long on this earth. We have a short amount of time, and we believe we have a short amount of time until Jesus comes back. And may that stimulate us more and more every day. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your word tonight. And we give you honor and praise because you're worthy. In Jesus' name, amen.